Hello and welcome back to our in-depth analysis. Today we're focusing on that narrow waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. If we had to define its current state in one sentence, it would be, the master valve of the world's energy is being held in an invisible grip, and the entire world is struggling to catch its breath. Since the US and Israel launched military strikes against Iran on the 28th of last month, while the strait hasn't been physically blocked, it has effectively entered a state of de facto closure. Today, let's break down three critical questions. How are the countries standing right on the strait faring? How has global trade been disrupted? And among the world's major economies, who is bleeding and who is just catching their breath? Part 1. Countries on the strait's edge. Proximity brings disaster, not prosperity. First, let's look at the nations immediately bordering this waterway. Iran, on the northern shore, seems to hold the initiative with the power to choke the strait, but in reality, it's wielding a double-edged sword. Iran exports about 1.7 million barrels of oil daily through here, the lifeline of its fiscal revenue. Blocking the strait, while retaliating against the US and Israel, would also mean cutting off its own income. Based on recent export scales, an export halt could cost Iran several $100 million per day. So, Iran's current strategy is clear. I won't completely block it, but I'll use drones and missiles to constantly harass shipping, making it too risky for anyone to transit. This gray zone tactic pressures the West while leaving itself a way out. Now look at the southern shore. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq. They are the truly innocent victims of this crisis. Saudi Arabia's over 5.5 million barrels of daily crude, and virtually all of Qatar's LNG depend entirely on this waterway. Morgan Stanley estimates that if the strait were completely closed, these producers would have to halt operations after about 25 consecutive days simply because they couldn't ship their oil out. Although Saudi Arabia and the UAE have built pipelines bypassing the strait, their replacement capacity is limited, unable to compensate for the daily supply gap of 8 to 10 million barrels. Countries like Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar have almost no alternative export routes, essentially betting their national fortunes on a waterway that could be cut at any moment. Part 2. Global trade, from freight costs to insurance, facing a tsunami. Now, let's look at the trade level. Many think that as long as ships can still move, trade is fine. Wrong. The pricing logic for global energy transport has completely shifted from being supply-demand driven to being dominated by geopolitical risk. First, freight rates. Data shows that charter rates for very large crude carriers, VLCCs, from the Middle East to China have doubled, exceeding $40,000 per day. The Baltic Exchange's dirty tanker index surged over 23% in a single day, and China's import crude oil freight index spiked nearly 70%. What does this mean? It means even if you can buy the oil, the cost of shipping it back will be painfully high. Second, insurance. Many international insurers have now either canceled or significantly hiked war risk insurance for the area. Analysts suggest the cost of war risk premiums for a large tanker transiting the strait has skyrocketed compared to normal levels, effectively pricing some out of the market. Major global shipping lines, Maersk, MSC, CM, ACGM, are pausing bookings and rerouting vessels via the Cape of Good Hope. This detour adds weeks to transit times and completely disrupts supply chain schedules. The deeper impact lies in supply chain contagion. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just for oil. About 1/3 of the world's seaborne fertilizer also passes through here. If fertilizer is cut off, how will crops be grown? Rising energy prices are already transmitting through petrochemical feedstocks and agricultural production to end consumer food prices, brewing a wave of imported inflation. Part 3. A global economic snapshot. Who suffers? Who benefits? Finally, let's widen the lens and examine how different major economies are being affected by this crisis. Asian nations are the primary victims. 82% of the crude oil leaving the Strait of Hormuz heads to Asia. China, as the world's largest energy importer, faces risk for its daily procurement of over 7 million barrels of Middle Eastern crude. Japan relies on the Middle East for 90% of its crude oil imports. Some research institutions warn that a prolonged blockade could shrink Japan's GDP by 3%. India has already begun curtailing natural gas supplies to some industrial users, forcing ceramics plants to shut down. Pakistan has been forced to reduce gas supplies to industrial customers, impacting urea production and thus food security. South Korea has also implemented emergency measures, its first oil price caps in nearly 30 years. Europe, while less directly dependent on Middle Eastern energy than Asia, cannot escape the reality of a globally integrated energy market. European natural gas prices have risen by roughly 70% since the conflict intensified. Germany's gas storage levels have reportedly dropped to critically low levels, around 21% in some analyses. Energy-intensive industries, like those represented by companies such as BASF or Siemens Energy, have seen their stock prices fall. Inflationary pressures in the Eurozone are mounting again, forcing Europe to reconfront its fragile dependence on imported fossil fuels. In the United States, although it's a major oil producer itself, the global price surge pushes up domestic gasoline prices, recently adding significant cost to American drivers. Interestingly, in an attempt to calm the market, the U.S. Treasury reportedly eased sanctions on Russia, allowing purchases of Russian oil already in transit. This is a tacit admission. Without Russian energy, the global market can't be stabilized. This brings us to a subtle beneficiary, Russia. With Middle Eastern oil supplies disrupted and Europe's gas crisis deepening, Russia's strategic space for energy exports has actually widened. Reports even emerged of the EU urging Ukraine to restore flows via the Druzhba oil pipeline, signaling a substantive loosening of Western energy sanctions against Russia. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz is essentially a stress test for the current global energy system. It starkly reminds us that when a waterway, just over 30 kilometers wide, becomes the Achilles heel of the world economy, any localized military friction can rapidly escalate into a global economic tsunami. For nations dependent on this strait, the short-term task is coping with high oil prices and soaring costs. The long-term imperative is clear: diversify risks and accelerate the energy transition. Because no one can guarantee that when the next storm hits, we will be so fortunate again. Thanks for watching this in-depth analysis. We'll see you next time.